Thank you all very much for venturing over to this far side of the conference center. I really appreciate it. Man, it's really nice to see this many people interested in OS deployment. I've heard many times for the past few months, oh, OS deployment's dead or it's dying. Well, you'll see that it's not quite dead yet, not by a long shot. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Mittner. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a Microsoft partner called Model Technology Solutions. In a former life, I used to be one of the developers for a little product called the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which we're going to demonstrate in some detail today. So today, we're going to talk about deploying Windows 10. This is a back to the basics course. So why are we going back to the basics? Well, first of all, there's a lot of people who are not familiar with OS deployment. There's a lot of new people in the industry who haven't seen it. And for those of you who might be a little bit more seasoned with OS deployment, there's some new technologies, there's some new changes that even deployment masters really need to get up to speed on when it comes to deploying Windows 10. It's really a shift in mindset from what we've done in the past, where everything in the past was, let's just blow everything away and install new. And that's not going to be the default that you might want to push out to all of your users when it comes to Windows 10. So we're going to cover a whole bunch of tools today. There are a lot of technologies that are involved when you talk about OS deployment. First of all, we're going to talk about Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. Microsoft Deployment Toolkit is a free tool that Microsoft has released. It's actually currently owned by the System Center Configuration Manager team. So a lot of the same developers who are developing OSD inside of System Center Configuration Manager are the same developers that are coding for the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. We will talk about System Center Configuration Manager. We will touch on Windows deployment services. We'll cover several aspects inside of the Windows ADK. There are several tools inside the ADK, one of them being the Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer. It's really nice when you cram all those together. It comes out as Wicked. So we will be talking about Wicked and all of the tools that are part of OSD. Now, I am a firm believer that you don't come to these technical conferences to read slides. So these are about the only slides I have. And the whole rest of the time I'll be doing demonstrations. So hopefully you will enjoy that. There will be plenty to see in other sessions. Now this is, like I said, an intro course. I won't be going super deep into any one of these technologies, but this is to prepare you from the whole plethora of OSD courses or presentations that are available throughout this week. And I'll list some of those at the end. So when we talk about deploying Windows 10, like I said earlier, our mindset needs to change. In the past, we have always pushed on, all right, let's completely wipe the box. Or there were two modes of thought generally for OS deployment. Let's only deploy whenever we get brand new machines, which could be a very large project. I worked for an energy company. They had about 150,000 desktops in their environment. They're on a 3-year refresh cycle. So we do the math. They're deploying about 50,000 machines a year through refresh. So it's a pretty daunting project in and of itself. The other method is, let's just go ahead and take some of our existing systems and let's just wipe them and install. And that was a big approach going from, say, Windows XP to Windows 7. We wanted to wipe everything off that machine, back up the user data with the user state migration tool, restore that data, restore that app. So that's a very solid approach. It's a very sound approach. Only problem with that is it takes a really long time. Not necessarily to install the operating system, but you also have to worry about what are all of the applications that need to be installed once that user has gotten their machine back in their hands. So even if you could fully automate that, you're still talking hour, 2 hours of time that user is without their system. And even after that, there's still some customizations that the user might lose. Icon placement on their desktop, organization for certain applications. They might lose some of those settings. So with Windows 10, upgrade is actually a very feasible option. Now, I've been up on stage many times, and I've never, ever, ever told anyone to go ahead and upgrade your system. In fact, I've lived through the pains of the Windows Vista days where if you did an upgrade in place from Windows XP to Windows Vista, that could take 6 hours of time to do that deployment. So nobody ever did it. In fact, we used to have the support inside of the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit for doing an upgrade in place. However, no one ever used it. In fact, we had a bug filed against the upgrade process, and it was 5 years since we had written that code. So no one had ever used that for 5 years until somebody finally tried it and then filed a bug against it. It just hadn't been used that much in the past. In fact, upgrade by default is not supported inside of Configuration Manager. It's not supported inside of MDT as of now. Now, that will be changing with future versions. It will be changing through the processes. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So like I said, inside of Configuration Manager 2012, upgrading from an operating system is not natively supported. If you walk through the task sequence wizard, there's no built-in template for doing an upgrade from one operating system to another. There is some announcements with Configuration Manager 2016, I believe is going to be the name for it. The technical preview that was released yesterday. When you do walk through the wizards, upgrading from a previous OS is now built into the wizard, so that will be directly supported. However, for the time being, you're still going to have to do a little bit of work. Now, thankfully, the System Center Configuration Manager team released on their blog a few months ago, back when the first Windows 10 technical preview came out, a process, a pre-built task sequence that would allow you to upgrade from, say, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, all the way up to Windows 10. Now, what I've done is I've gone ahead and imported that task sequence inside of my Configuration Manager console. So I'm going to edit that really quick, just to show you what this looks like. And you can see here, it's a pretty short task sequence. This is not your standard task sequence of old. Now, does this include every single step you'll need to do for doing an upgrade in your environment? No. You're going to want to customize this. You're probably going to want to run some additional prerequisite checks. You're probably going to run some additional things like potentially decrypting using hard drive encryption or disabling protectors or doing some things like that when you do that upgrade to make that work. This is a sample that is available that you can use to start playing around and working with this. So if we look through this, the first step in this task sequence is check readiness. So with the check readiness, I'm just looking for some basic things. I'm looking to make sure I've got at least 2 gig of RAM. I'm looking for my minimum processor speed, my minimum disk space, and this ensure current OS to be refreshed is client. It's a really important step. There's a lot of people who don't include this check readiness step inside their normal task sequences, even with their Windows 7 deployments today. And I'm sure you've heard about the big accidents that have occurred where people have accidentally deployed Windows 7 to all of their domain controllers and wiped out their entire environment. If they were using this check readiness step, which is a built-in step inside of Configuration Manager, that task sequence would have never worked on those domain controllers. It would have stopped. It would have hit that and said, hey, I'm trying to install a client operating system on a server. I can't do that. It would exit the task sequence. So always make sure you add this step. There are also some nice features in the new 2016 preview that prevent you from doing those mass deployments. We go into the next step. We've got a little script. Now, this script is just a little PowerShell script And all this does is do some things like stop certain services that could potentially interfere with the upgrade process. So it's not a lot to it. Then we're staging some content, deploying some scripts, so that the setup process can use those scripts as part of the out-of-box experience, as part of the post-setup process. And this is all it takes to upgrade. Let me zoom in on this. I'm just calling setup.exe directly from Windows, and I'm doing an auto upgrade, quiet, no reboot. I'm disabling dynamic updates for the setup process. After it runs the out-of-box experience, the UBI, it's going to run a script that's inside of that folder. If for some reason there is a failure, then it's going to run the rollback script inside of that folder. So that's all it takes to do an upgrade in my environment. So after that step runs, then we're going to look to see if we have a failure, restart the computer, install software updates, and then clean up. Now, if we get a failure for any reason, we're going to trigger the rollback, and then it's going to clean up the environment. So let's see how this works. So what I've got is I've got my test sequence. I've got my deployments. I've actually deployed this to a collection, and that collection is called Windows 10 Upgrade. So let's go ahead and add my test machine into this collection. In this case, I only have one machine, so it's a little bit easier to find. Okay. All right. So now that I have my machine in that collection, let me just make sure it is there. And it's there. Okay, let me go over to my client. Force a policy refresh on this system. There we go, new software is available. I'll hop into my software center. Now keep in mind, this is a Windows 7 machine. This is a Windows 7 enterprise system, and what I'm going to be deploying is a Windows 10 Enterprise Edition. So I'm doing an upgrade in place, and I'm going to essentially keep all the applications and all the settings that are on this system. So I've got my operating system set to deploy, install. It's warning me, you're about to install an operating system. Are you sure you want to do that? And now it's going to go ahead and kick off. And from an end user standpoint, that's a great experience, quite honestly, because you could make this available to your end users, let them choose when they want to install, when they want to go. Whenever they click it, it will install. All of their applications will be there. All of their files will be there. And it definitely is not like Vista. It's not going to take 6 hours worth of time in order to do that deployment. You're looking at potentially under an hour to do a deployment, at least that's how things are going with current builds. How you do it unattended? That was essentially how I did it unattended, is basically... Well, so you can make it required. So the question is, how do you do it unattended, right? So I made this an optional deployment. So let's go back into this. You look at my actual deployment. I made this available to install. So if I wanted to make it required, unattended, I would choose that. I would have a new deployment set to required, and then I would schedule whenever I want that to install in the system. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and let that kick off and install. I'm going to go back to my slides. Now that's it, right? I mean, if we can do an upgrade in place, why do we need to do anything else, right? So let's just upgrade everything. Well, unfortunately, you can't just upgrade everything. There's always going to be caveats. One of the bigger caveats is around security, potentially around something called UEFI, which is a BIOS setting. It's a way to install the operating system in a certain way. Now, why do you need UEFI? Well, UEFI provides a security feature inside of Windows 10 called Secure Boot. Why is Secure Boot important? Well, with Secure Boot, I'm securing the boot process on the operating system so nothing can interfere with that particular boot process. There was a session yesterday on Windows 10 for the enterprise. In that session, they demonstrated some of the new security features. One of those security features was to prevent an attack called Pass the Hash. Now, Pass the Hash is a hacker tool, not just something they do for fun in Washington State. So to prevent that, you need Secure Boot. Well, the challenge is most Windows 7 deployments that are out there today do not have UEFI enabled. You cannot do an upgrade in place from a non-UEFI to a UEFI. So if you want to enable UEFI boot, if you want to enable Secure Boot, you are going to have to do a wipe and load on those particular machines. Now, you could evaluate the risk and decide it's more important that I get some of the additional security features or the additional enhancements in Windows 10, and then I can come back and revisit UEFI at my next asset refresh or whenever I purchase new machines. But you cannot enable that in a deployment. You could also have situations where you've got third-party disk encryption software. Third-party disk encryption software may not work with the upgrade process. Now, there's some ways you might be able to add it into the task sequence to disable that or decrypt it, but my goodness, decrypting a large hard drive with some of the third-party disk encryption, it would take less time to wipe the machine than to decrypt the disk. So there also could be some issues with third-party antivirus software. So right now, Microsoft is going through a whole slew of tests, as well as third parties like myself and others that are going through evaluating what are all the potential failures for an upgrade process. So that we can have those clearly documented so you can make an informed decision on when you can do an upgrade and when you can't do an upgrade. So unfortunately, upgrade is not the end-all, be-all answer for every single scenario, but it's still a really nice improvement, a really nice feature to have. Which brings us to the wipe and load scenario. So the wipe and load scenario is deployment as it was in the past. So in this particular case, I'm taking the operating system, I'm adding in the tools like the user state migration tool and the underlying tools inside the Windows ADK, and then I'm deploying that to my system. And I can use any number of tools to do that. I can use the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, I can use System Center Configuration Manager, and I can deploy an operating system just like I've always done in the past. So let's do a quick demo of what it looks like to do a wipe and load. Okay. So for this demo, the last demo I used Configuration Manager. This one I'm going to use Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. So the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, like I said, is a free tool for Microsoft. When you install it, it does require that you install the Windows ADK. So all of the Microsoft tools use the Windows ADK by default. They use those as the underlying technologies to make everything function. So whenever I install this, I've got a deployment workbench, but I don't have any deployments here. So let me create a new deployment share pretty quickly. So I'm just going to call this a deployment share, give it a share name, give it a quick description. I'm just going to accept these as defaults. And now I have a new deployment share. So when I look at my deployment share, I can manage my applications that I might want to include, operating systems, drivers. Packages are really for things like language packs, if you want to include that. And then the task sequence is what ties it all together. So let me go ahead and add in an operating system. I'm going to do a custom image file. I'm going to go out to folder where I've already got one. And it's going to ask me whether or not setup files are needed. Since I'm deploying Windows 10, setup files are not needed. All I need is the install.wim file from the sources folder, and then click on Next, give it a name. This is Windows 10 Enterprise, 64-bit. Next. And it's going to go ahead and import this. Now, for those of you who don't know, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit is fully built on top of PowerShell. So everything that I'm doing inside of here in the console can be fully automated through PowerShell. So every single action, every single command, once that command completes, there's a view script button. You can use that view script button to get the actual PowerShell command. And then once you do that, you can add that to your own script. So everything that I'm doing in terms of adding an operating system, creating folders, adding drivers, creating a task sequence, all of that can be performed through automation, through PowerShell. Yes? Great question. So the question is, what are the minimum software and hardware requirements for Windows 10? They are essentially the same as what they are for Windows 7 and or Windows 8. The hardware requirements haven't really changed that much. In terms of software requirements, the actual disk space is similar as well to what a Windows 8.1 deployment is. But in terms of doing an upgrade in place, you need to have Windows 7 with the latest service pack, and then you can upgrade from Windows 7 with the latest service pack all the way to Windows 8, Windows 8.1 with the update associated with that, and then you can upgrade all of those to Windows 10. Great question. So this is wrapping up. Now, the next thing that I could do is I could add in all of my drivers. Now, drivers you can organize based on the particular makes and models of your systems. You can download the drivers directly from a vendor like Dell, who provides a driver cab. In fact, the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit will allow you to just point to that cab file itself, and it does the job of doing the extraction and then exporting out all of those driver files and putting them in the folder structures inside of MDT. The other OEM vendors have come online and started to support that as well, so you can now download driver packs from HP, you can download driver packs from Lenovo. So it's been pretty amazing to see the support that we've gotten out of this. For time's sake, I'm going to skip out-of-box drivers, though there are going to be a lot of sessions on OS deployment, so you can get that. So I'm going to create a task sequence now. Give it an ID. I'm going to choose a standard client task sequence. I'm going to choose the operating system that I just imported. I don't need a product key since this is an enterprise edition. Provide some basic information, give it a very secure password. That figured the first one. Yep. And now I have a task sequence. Now the only thing left for me to do would be to create my custom Windows PE image that would do the deployment. To do that, I would just right-click on my deployment share and say Update Deployment Share, and that would create my Windows PE image. Once I've done that, that's where I can take advantage of the Windows Deployment Services. So Windows Deployment Services is what allows you to do PXE boots. So boot off the network to do the OS deployment. In this particular case, I have two images out here, one for creating an image and one for actually deploying an image. So if I want to create my own baseline image, I've got a boot image specifically for that. Okay, so now that I've got that cooked, let's go to a client and start a deployment. I forgot to add the caveat earlier that everything that I'm demonstrating is on beta software that isn't quite done yet. So there's a good chance that some things probably won't work in my demos, and there's also a good chance that what you do when you go home a week from now won't be the same actions that I performed. Because the technology is changing. Now, they are starting to stabilize the code, and things are starting to straighten out in terms of processes, but things are definitely changing, especially when I get into my next section. So what I'm doing right now is I'm booting off of my Windows PE image, and it's going to boot up and start asking me for information that I provide in a wizard. So it's going to ask me what task sequence I want to deploy, what applications I want to deploy, and then it'll go ahead and kick off. Now, the support currently is not built in to do the user state migration tool from a Windows 7 to Windows 10, but that will be coming very soon with this. So what you would do is you would boot up either through this, or you would start the task sequence from an existing operating system, walk through the wizard. If you're deploying or you're doing a wipe and load from a Windows 7 or Windows 8 box, you would run the user state migration tool, which it would do automatically, back up all of your data, would keep it all locally using hard links, so it's super fast to do the deployment, and then install the new operating system, restore those user files back where they were before. Yes, start a new one. That was just prompting me saying, hey, you had a task sequence running already. Do you want to do a new one or resume the old one?
Quick question.
Yes.
Was the WIN file provided to you in the Windows 10 Enterprise folder, or is that something you captured?
Great question. So the question is, so the WIM file that I used, was that something that I captured earlier, or was it just in the sources folder? I actually got that WIM file directly from the Windows 10 ISO image, so it's from the sources folder itself. So with Windows 10, you don't have to worry about the silly drive letter issues to where you deploy it. It ends up coming up as a D drive instead of a C drive and so forth. So you can use the WIM file directly from the Microsoft source folder if you're not providing any customizations. So in this particular case, I've got my Windows 10 Enterprise x64. And then I can provide some details, like what domain I want to join. It's going to ask me, do I want to move my data and settings? Now, remember what I just said. the support for using USMT in an offline fashion is not currently enabled with Windows 10 as of yet. If it were, you would be able to move data, user data and settings, and it would migrate all the user's data off of that existing system. I don't need a product key in this case because I'm deploying Enterprise. Great question. So the question is, do I need to do any decryption with BitLocker? You would if you were doing a wipe and load and you were wanting to use the user state migration tool in order to do the backup. Now, the task sequence itself has the logic built into it, is that when you when you run the task sequence from within a current operating system, there's logic in there to disable the BitLocker protectors. And so it'll disable the BitLocker protectors, won't decrypt the disk because that takes a really long time, but disables the protectors, then installs a new operating system, and then re-enables the protectors. When you do it that way, it's very fast to both decrypt, even though you're not decrypting, and then re-encrypt, as you're just disabling, re-enabling the same protectors that are on that disk. It's built directly into the task sequence. So it's built into the standard task sequence. All right. Let me grab a product key really quick. I've got one here. Yeah, choose my time zone. Then you can choose applications. Now, I've got applications for tons of items that you could potentially install as part of this. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. I've got my administrator password, and then it's going to ask me about BitLocker. Do I want to enable BitLocker or not enable BitLocker? Click on Begin, and now it's go ahead and starting my deployment of Windows 10 onto that system. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, what are the differences between Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and when do you use System Center Configuration Manager versus Microsoft Deployment Toolkit? So people ask me that a lot. They're like, do I use one or the other? And I generally say yes. The reason why is one enhances the other. So System Center Configuration Manager is a great tool for deploying the operating system. However, there are a lot of things that System Center Configuration Manager does not do by default. It doesn't have a very good rules engine for doing dynamic deployments. There's a lot of additional steps. I think MDT extensions on Config Manager add about 500 improvements to the whole Configuration Manager experience. So it's great to use System Center Configuration Manager to deploy your image. Use MDT on top of Configuration Manager as an extension into Configuration Manager. When you're capturing your image, I still recommend using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit to actually capture your image. The reason why is because the environment to set up Microsoft Deployment Toolkit for an image capture is relatively simple. It's really easy to add new items, to remove items. You can do things like pause the task sequence in the middle of the installation. So if you need to make changes to things like look and feel of the desktop or start menu or things that could be hard to code, you can do that through Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. Is it possible to do all that within SCCM? Yeah, but you're doing some pretty major registry hacks in order to make all that work. So use MDT to create your image. Once you create your image, take your image, add it into SCCM, deploy that image with SCCM using the MDT extensions on top of that. Does that make sense? Thanks. Okay. Let's check on our Windows 8 deployment and see where we're at. So at this point, we are downloading the files, and we're still installing. So still going. Okay. So let's talk about the next step. So now we've talked about upgrading, which upgrading is a great scenario. I can upgrade existing systems, keep all the users' files, and get everything back the way it was before. However, we've talked about it doesn't necessarily work in all scenarios. So for those scenarios where you can't do an upgrade, or those scenarios where your system breaks, you need to re-image, you might need to do a wipe and load on that. So what's the next method of doing deployments? And the next method is doing provisioning. So what is provisioning? So provisioning is the idea that I get a new machine. So a demonstration that they've used at this conference is I call up my corporate office, my laptop is completely died, I have a demonstration to give tomorrow, I'm going to go down to Best Buy, I'm going to buy a new computer, I need this set up with all my stuff and all my environment. Now this is a royal pain to do with Windows 7. It was a royal pain to do with Windows 8.1. I've worked with organizations that they're like, yeah, in order to support a new system, a new hardware model, we need at least 4 weeks lead time or 6 weeks lead time. So we need to make sure all the drivers work, all of our applications work, all the things that go along with that. So supporting a new system is not a trivial process. Now, with some automation, you can make that go much quicker. However, wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to worry about drivers? Wouldn't it be great if I could just take a system that somebody purchased and I could clean up that system, add in the pieces that I specifically need for that system so that it can join our domain, get access to my applications, get access to those users folders, get access to their data, all within a matter of a few minutes. And this is where the concept of provisioning. So the idea would be to go buy a new machine. When I turn it on to that machine, it's going to ask you for your organizational account or your Microsoft account. So if you've got Azure Active Directory configured at this point, you can log on with your user credentials for your Azure AD at that very first logon screen. Now, by doing that, you are essentially provisioning that machine, and it's getting access to your EMS environment or your enterprise mobility system, so that gets provisioned. You're added to that particular domain. When you log on, you're going to have access to your OneDrive folder, your OneDrive Pro folders. You're going to have access to your SharePoint site. So you're going to be able to get access to all of your data. However, you're still in a situation where you might need things like VPN connectivity, or you might need things like I bought a Pro SKU and I really want my systems to be on Enterprise SKU of my system so I can get access to direct access. And that's where provisioning really shines, or will shine, inside of Windows 10. So let's show you what that looks like. So what I have here is I've got a pretty plain stock Windows 10 image. Now this is running build 10076. It was released last week. It's a lot of fun prepping for this session because every time I'd build out my environment, Microsoft would release a new version. So I'd have to rebuild and retest everything. So this is a pretty plain environment. I have installed the Windows 10 ADK, and the one that I believe it was released on Thursday or Friday of last week. There is a release candidate version of the Windows 10 ADK on that. So I'm going to launch the Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer, which I like to call Wicked. Oh, I've already got one running. I think the Windows team would prefer I call it the Windows ICD instead of the Wicked, but I like Wicked. So when I do this, I'm going to do a File, New Project. I have a choice of doing a provisioning package or imaging. Windows ICD can be used for a couple of different purposes. Windows ICD can be used from an OEM's perspective in order to customize an image specifically for your environment, or it can be used for provisioning, which you can use in your environment to create a provisioning file to deploy to your own systems. So I'm going to create a provisioning package. Notice I have an option here of using Windows Common or using Windows Phone. So you can actually deploy provisioning packages to Windows Phone. Give it a name. If I had another provisioning package that I wanted to include and kind of nest them, I could do that. So here I've got my project 2. If I drill down under Settings, notice that I can do things like add certificates. So if I need to add in my trusted root certificates for my own corporate environment so that users can get access to their VPN, they can get access to their remote desktop gateway, they can get access to their files, you can add in those certificates directly inside of here. I can also add in connections like proxies. I can add in connectivity profiles on the system as well for things like ActiveSync and your wireless network settings. So I can define wireless LAN profiles inside of here. I can define Internet Explorer settings, things like favorites and what the first run URL is for this particular system. The one that I'm going to demonstrate, though, is under Windows Licensing. There's a Upgrade Edition product key. So the Upgrade Edition product key says that that user may have purchased a Windows 10 professional device. However, they need to have access to direct access. Windows 10 Professional does not provide direct access. So I need to upgrade them to Windows 10 Enterprise. So in order to do that, all I need to do is add an Upgrade Edition product key and paste in my product key inside of here. So this is a product key that would give me enterprise access. So let me save this. And I'm going to do an export of this to a provisioning package. I'm going to tell it to put this on my desktop. I'm going to call this change product key. And click on build. So if I go over to my desktop now, I've got what looks like an executable on my desktop. In fact, it's a PPKG file, .ppkg file, which is a file extension. Underneath this, it's actually just a WIM file. So if I open this up with something like 7-zip, I go under Common Settings, here's my XML file, and there's that product key that I entered in. So this is essentially where it all gets stored. Now, remember, as I walk through that wizard, one of the things it asks you to do is, do you want to encrypt this? So if you're including a lot of sensitive data inside of this provisioning package, then you would want to encrypt that file so that somebody can't just open that up and view the details. So the idea of this would be to take this particular provisioning package, this one particular file, along with the cert associated with that, throw that up on your EMM system, or some other method that you provide. You could throw it up on the corporate OneDrive or something like that, and then let a user essentially kick it off and run it from there. So let's go back to my scenario. User gets a brand new laptop. They log on with their Azure AD. When they log on with their Azure ID, it automatically connects them up to Windows Intune. When it comes in as Windows Intune looks and says, okay, for this particular user, let's go ahead and deploy these particular packages to this particular system. So when they do that, then it's going to install this particular provisioning package, which could give them all of their VPN connectivity, could have their browser settings, and it will upgrade their edition from professional to enterprise. Now this does not fully work yet, but let me show you what it would look like. If I were to run this, it's going to tell me, you're going to go ahead and install this. And this could be a way to add drivers, add languages, add applications, change security configuration on that system. And it basically says, as soon as you click on allow on this, it's going to run this, it's going to shut down the machine, restart the machine, and apply those settings. Now, unfortunately, right now, what it does is when I click on allow on this, it doesn't do anything. It just ends. So hopefully that will get fixed pretty quickly. But keep you from being totally empty-handed with the demonstration, I'm going to show you, using some of the built-in Windows ADK tools, how you can perform something similar with an image. So what I've got is I've got my professional image that I got from the ISO. So and what I'm doing is I'm doing the PowerShell command, mount Windows image, telling it to go to the mount directory and giving it a path to that particular WIM. So that takes a long time to run, so cooking show style, I've gone ahead and done that. So if you look, there's my WIM file. So all of the install.wim is there. So now I just need to run and look to see what additions are available. So I'm going to run a command dism/image, point it to my mount directory, and then run a /get-target additions. Now, the previous example, I used the PowerShell command. Unfortunately, there's no equivalent PowerShell command for get target addition, so I have to use dism itself in order to run this. So let me click on this. And notice that this particular edition can be upgraded to Professional WMC. I'm not quite sure what that is. Enterprise and Education. Education was an interesting SKU I didn't even know existed until I ran this particular command. So be curious to see what that Education SKU is. Now that I have that, I know what I can upgrade to. Now I just do a set Windows Edition, give it a path, /mount, give it an edition, enterprise, and let's all cross our fingers and hope this works. So what this is doing is going through and it's changing this edition from professional, which is what it was currently, and it's changing it over to enterprise. So after this command completes, that WIM file is now an enterprise ISO. It's a great trick, by the way, if you're wanting to deploy Windows 10 Enterprise, but you're on the slow ring, but you want some of the newer builds, you can download the ISOs of the newer builds and get the WIM file and then run this command, and boom, you've got an enterprise edition that you can now kick out and deploy. So this is nearly complete. After this runs, the only thing left for me to do on this would be to save this to my disk, commit the WIM change, and then I would be Done. Right. Well, while that's running, let's go check on some of our other systems. So right now it's actually kicking off and running my upgrade windows. So behind the scenes, it's kicked off and run setup.exe. And this is essentially completely unattended from this point on. It will reboot and install Windows 10.
Question regarding the imaging and configuration designer
Yes.
provisioning. Does that require like an Azure account or some type of cloud service, or can you run that?
So great question. So the imaging and configuration designer, does that require Azure or anything online? No, it is a completely built-in tool as part of the Windows ADK. So you just download the Windows ADK and the Windows ICD is included directly from there. So you don't need to do that whole provisioning scenario that I discussed with where you log on to Azure AD and things like that. You can just create your own provisioning package and you can just publish that out however you want, because it's essentially just a file that somebody needs to execute in order to run it. I mean, you can email it to somebody as a zip file and you're good. Go back to my Windows 10. All right, so I've got this. So the only thing left for me to do is dismount Windows image, path C:\\mount, and save. And this saves my image and makes it an Enterprise Edition. Okay. Notice that the one that I installed earlier is now complete. So the one that I installed using the Light Touch MDT process, that is now complete, and I've got a fully running system. So to recap, we talked today about the three primary ways of doing a deployment. So the first thing we talked about was doing an in-place or doing an upgrade process. This essentially lets Windows do all the work. It preserves all of your data, all of your settings. It keeps all of your apps. It keeps all of your drivers. It installs your standard OS image, not a custom. That's another thing right now, is you can't use a custom image and do an upgrade process. So you have to use a built-in Windows image in order to do an upgrade. It does restore everything on that system. So you don't have to worry about reinstalling applications, redoing drivers. So it does everything. This is the recommended approach for most existing devices. However, the caveats are that, remember, you do not get UEFI/secure boot support when you're doing an upgrade in place. If you need that right out of the box, then go ahead and do a wipe and load. Wipe and load is the more traditional approach that will be supported for quite some time, where it captures all of your settings, deploys your own custom image if you'd like it to, installs drivers, injects all the drivers, installs the applications, restores all of your data and settings back to the way it was before. This is possible to do not only using Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which is what I demonstrated today, but you can also use Configuration Manager to do the deployment. It's kind of interesting putting these demos together because not all the technologies work with all of the current builds. So MDT supports deploying Windows 10, but not upgrading right now. Configuration Manager supports upgrading, but not deploying right now. But this will all come together. Provisioning. Provisioning is another new scenario, and this is to solve the problem of how do I get a brand new system where I don't have to worry about drivers, I don't have to worry about getting that enrolled onto my system. All I have to do is run a provisioning package that configures things that are specific to my enterprise, can upgrade the product edition, remove potentially some other items on my system, potentially, eventually join it to the domain or use your own process to join it to the domain. So this is a brand new capability for new devices in the environment as well. Lots of great resources out there. So the first one is my company's blog. There's Johan's blog, Deployment Research, the MDT team blog. They've recently started blogging again. Michael Niehaus's blog, Keith Garner, he was another former MDT developer, and of course the Windows Insider team. Like I said, there are a ton of additional sessions, and I didn't even get a chance to add all of them to this particular list. So keep a look out there. There's even some hands-on labs over there that are available. So go out, learn, play with it, and start to deploy. So with that, I will be happy to take any questions that we have. Yes, sir. Yep. Yeah, so the question is, will Windows 10 still upgrade on a legacy BIOS? Absolutely. So if you want to get Windows 10 now, you can do your upgrade in place with legacy BIOS and then revisit the UEFI at a later point in time. So you don't have to go UEFI to start with. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So great question. So will the upgrade process and the wipe and load require two different task sequences, or can they be in the same task sequence? As of right now, they would require two separate task sequences. And that's because the underlying logic on how an upgrade works is significantly different than that. But Aaron Chichowski, who's the program manager for both MDT and Configuration Manager, is going to be demonstrating in detail the upgrade process at a session, I believe, tomorrow. So make sure you stop by his session to see more detail on that. So great question. So when you're upgrading from, say, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1 to Windows 10, how does the upgrade process deal with the drivers? So first thing it would do is it would look to see whether or not there are inbox drivers that are a better match for that particular device than the driver that is currently in use. If so, it's going to use that inbox driver for that particular device. If there is not an inbox driver, then it will try to use the existing driver for that particular device and use that if it will work. If that will not work, you'll end up with the yellow bang in Device Manager. You'll have to deploy those later. And that's where extensions to that upgrade task sequence could really come in handy, because you could apply your drivers that you know do not work at the end of that task sequence and get those installed. Yep. Any other questions? So will this apply to Windows servers and Windows Nano servers? So Windows Server, yes. You can fully deploy using this mechanism. The wipe and load, except you're not using user state migration tool or anything like that. You can deploy an operating system with both Configuration Manager and MDT, a server operating system. Whether or not Nano Server works, I will say it's very unlikely that Nano Server will work with a Configuration Manager task sequence, just because the way the task sequence works. They might end up adding support to it. But with MDT, it very well could be possible. It's just NanoServer is so new, I just don't think they've had a chance to play with it yet. Yes. So the inclusion of the drivers is the same process. So the NanoServer to inject drivers essentially is the same process. You're using DISM to inject drivers associated with that. So yeah, it's pretty similar. Thank you. So great question. How does the upgrade work with the OEM recovery partition? Right now, the upgrade process would do nothing with the recovery partition. It would leave everything on the disk exactly the way it was laid out prior to doing the upgrade. You would have to come along either after the fact as part of a task sequence step or another process to clean up that OEM recovery partition. Is there a way to upgrade the recovery partition? There's always a way, yeah. so yeah, you could. You could write steps inside the task sequence that would go into that recovery partition, potentially mount it as a drive letter, remove the WIM file or the files that are there, and replace it with one that you specify. But right. It's a great question. So recovery does work slightly different, but yeah, you still have to work through that scenario. Yeah, that hasn't been fully fleshed out yet. So definitely understand your question. I understand completely. So. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Is the upgrade task sequence native to 2012 R2? It is not. So if you go out and you search for Windows 10 upgrade task sequence, the System Center Configuration Manager team posted that task sequence to their blog. You just download it from their blog, and you can import it directly in. Yes, that's correct. It's just a task sequence. It's not an update. There will be an update that will provide some support to do that, and I'm sure that they're going to improve, that task sequence as time goes on as well. Yeah. Again, I would go to Aaron Chachowski's session on upgrading to Windows 10 or what's new with OS deployment. I believe that session is tomorrow, and it's going to be, he's going to cover that upgrade process in quite a bit of detail, as well as the new changes in both Configuration Manager 2016 and the new changes inside of the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and that will handle that upgrade process. Yes, sir. Thank you for going to a mic.
Hello. In relation to if you're going to do an in-place upgrade when you have enabled BitLocker, what will happen with that in relation to the boot list? Is there these items which is controlled by the BitLocker?
So when it comes to BitLocker systems, so a BitLocker system would work fine doing an upgrade from, say, Windows 7 or Windows 8, 8.1. What you would need to do is there would be a step to add in the task sequence that would disable the protectors. It would not decrypt the disk, but it would disable the protectors on the system.
And that will also be updated in the MBAM in the backend for that?
Yes. Okay. Yep. And you can re-enable the protectors when you get into the new operating system.
Then a side question, that is the last one. In relation to the Hyper-V client for the Windows 10.
The Hyper-V client for Windows 10?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that will install by default.
Yeah, I know, but I need to give you my question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Have you seen use cases where you're actually deploying the Hyper-V plugin and then putting on the client system on top of that to be able to control that from the virtual machine manager? So actually the end users are having a virtualized client instead of putting it directly on the hardware?
Right. I have seen some use cases. I will say that there is some changes in how Windows 10 does some security, that it's actually using some of the native features of the Hyper-V client on Windows 10, so it will be installed by default on all Windows 10 systems. Because it actually takes a portion of the security database and stores it securely inside a quote-unquote virtual machine using some technologies inside of Hyper-V in order to do that. So it will be present. It will be installed on all Windows 10 systems. But other than that, other use cases for dev test or things like that, absolutely. I've seen some cases for AppCompat, but yeah, it's a lot of work to try to maintain a separate client operating system for AppCompat. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Quick question. You mentioned that it would be best to use the Windows for creating the images, the deployment kit,
Yes.
instead of using SCCM to
Yep.
create the image. You also show the Windows imaging configuration designer.
Yes.
Can you use that to create an image?
Yeah, so great question. Can you do imaging with Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer? Can you? Yes. Should you? I don't think so. It's similar to the question of, can you create an image using an unattend.xml file and running DISM commands and doing sysprep? Can you do that? Yes. It's just a lot more work. So the Windows ICD provides some pretty basic rudimentary support for creating a custom image. It doesn't provide the robust nature of neither MDT or Configuration Manager for creating an image. From an OEM perspective, it could be a bit easier to incorporate an ICD process into a factory process than it is to use something like MDT or Configuration Manager, because ICD does support booting into audit mode in order to make changes on that system. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. We have yet another deployment tool, but it's a bit more basic than the other tools as of right now. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Yep. So great question. In terms of application compatibility with Windows 10, Microsoft is pretty much guaranteed that if it works on Windows 7, at the very least it works on Windows 8.1, it will work on Windows 10. So the chances of having an AppCompat issue are small. Now, will it automatically shim an application in order to work? No, it won't automatically shim an application. However, all of the shimming technologies, the application compatibility toolkit, and the other tools that are available in order to allow applications to work will work fine. I mean, I've been running Windows 10 on my Surface Pro 3 for quite a while, and I will say after every build I have to go into my Cisco VPN client and tell it, this is a Windows 8 box. So basically shim the application to make it work. But yeah, it won't do that automatically, but the tools exist to make it happen. Thank you. Not currently. So the question is, can you use either MDT or SCCM in order to integrate with ICD? Not currently. There's not a way to do that. I was having a conversation with the program manager for OSD yesterday about is there a need for it? Is there value that could provide on that? And I think there's still some things that could be done in order to make that interface a little bit easier and tie it all into one place. But yeah, it's not there currently. I think there was a question back there.
You had mentioned that that you can't do the upgrade with a custom image.
Yes, sir.
Now, is that like it's never going to be possible, or it's just not possible right now?
I will say it's not possible right now, and I will say chances are probably pretty slim that it will be possible once Windows 10 releases.
Okay.
I'm not going to say it won't ever happen, but I will say it's a very slim chance that that's going to make it in. So the reason why is because it's an unpredictable upgrade path, because they made a lot of improvements to the upgrade process because they know it's always from a known source of installation files, and it's something that they can test with. With your own image, it's no longer a known source. I just don't think that they're willing to take that from a liability standpoint in their testing.
Okay. Hey, thank you. This was a great session. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So UEFI and Secure Boot. So when is it supported, not supported? And so in order to use UEFI, your disk have to be structured in a specific manner. It's not very likely, though some have done it with Windows 7. So Windows 7 by default used what was called a BIOS config. So used a master boot record and a BIOS config in order to store the operating system files and all the configuration on the system. Now, with Windows 8 and 8.1, you started to see more customers using UEFI because that was how the OEMs shipped their hardware. And by doing that, it laid the disk out in a specific manner with 4 different partitions and the way it organized that structure. Now, the reason why you can't do an upgrade from a non-UEFI to a UEFI is because that whole partition structure and the format, whether it's FAT or NTFS or things like that, needs to change whenever you go from non-UEFI to UEFI. So if you can't do that automatically, and you can't take an image or can't take an operating system that was deployed to BIOS and have that immediately available on a UEFI system. So Secure Boot requires UEFI to function because it interacts with the hardware at a little bit deeper level than what the BIOS can support. So Secure Boot basically writes information into the TPM on the hardware to say, here are my boot files. They were digitally signed at my install time. So every time I boot up, because of that UEFI BIOS, it's going to go out and look to see, are the files that I'm booting from still digitally signed with the same signature that I used when I did my installation? If they are not, then it will come up and give you a failure and you can't boot any longer. So it basically prevents tampering of your underlying boot files. Yeah, there's another security attack that people use. It's called the evil maid attack, where you leave your laptop in a hotel, maid comes in, she plugs in a USB device into your system, overwrites your boot files with a custom bootloader that they provide, and then next time you turn it on, now you have a keylogger installed that logs all your activity, blah, blah, blah. Well, that gets prevented with Secure Boot because no one can replace your boot files. Yep.
Talk about the kind of the scenario of going and buying a machine over the weekend and you boot it up.
Yep.
One of the things that I thought would be a challenge would be, well, it's going through the UBI process of creating a local profile and doing some things that are kind of local to the machine, and you won't have an opportunity to essentially switch over to a more of a domain profile. Is that going to be a scenario that you have to deal with and just have to code around, deal with, or is there going to be some type of shim that we can kind of some type of interruption during the UBI process that would be able to kind of prevent that from happening?
That's a great question, and I will say right now it's something you have to code around. And how I've been doing that is instead of using just a provisioning package, use a PowerShell script that goes and cleans everything up on that system, and then run my provisioning package to get it to a known state to take care of that situation. But yeah, it's not something that they've provided very good support as of now. The good thing is Windows is no longer static. So you're not stuck with this version of ICD for the next 3 years like in the past. There will be every 3, 4, 6 months new versions that will pop out that will take advantage of new features and technologies. Yeah. But I think I'm over time. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for sticking around and asking questions. I really appreciate the feedback, and enjoy the rest of your conference.